The morning sun hung low over the frontier town, casting long, cold shadows across the dusty streets. A heavy silence had settled, broken only by the occasional creak of a wooden sign swaying in the breeze or the distant bark of a dog. Today, the entire community had gathered in somber respect, drawn together by the death of John Harper, a man whose presence had once been a quiet but steady anchor in their lives. The small church, built from rough-hewn timber and faded paint, bore witness to the sorrow of a town that had seen too much hardship, yet had never confronted such a loss quite like this. Villagers arrived in clusters, their boots stirring up faint clouds of dust, their hats held tightly in their hands as if by mere grasp they could shield themselves from grief. Faces were pale, and eyes red from tears either shed in private or from memories too heavy to suppress. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth, mingling with the scent of wildflowers hastily gathered by neighbors in a gesture of condolence. Inside the church, wooden pews groaned under the weight of sorrow, each seat occupied by a person carrying the invisible burden of loss. Amid this quiet assembly, the sharp, piercing cry of an infant shattered the stillness, demanding attention in a way grief itself could not contain. The tiny baby, swaddled in a threadbare blanket, sat in the rough arms of a distant cousin who had only reluctantly volunteered to bring the child to the service. The cries were raw and unyielding, a harsh counterpoint to the measured murmurs of mourning that filled the church. For most of the townspeople, the sound was not only inconvenient but unsettling, a reminder that life messy, uncontained, and unpredictable continued even in the face of death. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Who's going to take care of him?" One woman murmured, glancing nervously toward the baby. "It's improper. A funeral is no place for such." "Such noise," another added. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the child as though the weight of the infant Esnead might transfer onto them. The tiny face, red and contorted with distress, seemed to plead for attention from anyone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to respond. The child's mother had long since passed, leaving him without the instinctive comfort of a familiar embrace. Now he was at the mercy of a community that struggled to navigate the delicate boundaries of etiquette, grief, and obligation. Each failed attempt by relatives or neighbors to soothe him only made his cries louder, echoing against the timber-bird walls and cold stone floors of the church. The congregation's collective unease grew, a palpable tension that seemed to fill every corner of the room. It was in these moments that the town's rigid social codes and quiet fears were laid bare. Yet, even in the midst of this tension, the baby's cries were a stark reminder that life pressed on relentlessly, demanding attention and care. The funeral, meant to be a ceremony of closure, had become a mirror reflecting not just sorrow but the inadequacy and hesitation of those who had always relied on structure and routine to guide their responses. The infant, oblivious to tradition or propriety, embodied raw human need, a need that would not wait for comfort on someone else's timetable. Outside the pews, at the edge of the gathering, a solitary figure observed the scene with quiet attention. Unlike the townspeople, he did not flinch at the sound or avert his gaze. He saw not a disturbance, but an opportunity, an opening where courage and empathy could bridge the divide between fear and action. In this quiet moment, the stage was set for an act that would challenge social norms, reveal hidden strengths, and reshape the town's understanding of compassion. The infant's cries grew sharper, more urgent, cutting through the solemn murmurs of the funeral like a knife. Each wail carried a desperate intensity, a raw demand for attention that no one seemed willing or able to satisfy. The baby's small fists batted at the swaddling blanket, tiny legs kicking against the fabric as if trying to push back the weight of the world pressing down on him. To anyone watching, he was a fragile, vulnerable creature, exposed and alone in a room that seemed to shrink around his helplessness. The relatives nearest to him shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond. They exchanged glances that spoke more of discomfort than compassion. One man coughed loudly, another muttered under his breath, "Someone ought to take him outside." But when hands reached tentatively toward the infant, he recoiled, crying louder, rejecting their unsure touch. It was as if he sensed their hesitation and reflected it back tenfold, amplifying the tension that hung thick in the church. The townspeople's unease was palpable. Their grief, once directed toward the deceased, now collided with the baby's need for care, and many were unprepared to navigate the two together. In whispered conversations, they debated who should take responsibility, yet no one moved decisively. The baby, meanwhile, offered no apology for his cries, no explanation for the piercing sound of his distress. He existed entirely in the present, governed by instinct, a reminder that life did not pause for decorum or social expectation. In his anguish, the infant became more than just a child. He became a mirror reflecting the town's failures. Each hesitant glance, each unwilling hand, revealed a collective discomfort with vulnerability and a fear of responsibility. The mourning adults, who had once felt competent and in control of their lives, now seemed powerless in the face of raw, unmediated need. The baby's cries, persistent and unyielding, forced the community to confront the limits of their compassion. Yet there was something undeniable in the infant's persistence, a stubborn spark of life that refused to be ignored. Even as he struggled against his swaddling, his small voice rising and falling like a storm, he reminded the villagers of a truth they often avoided, that life's demands do not pause for grief, propriety, or fear. For the child, the funeral was not about social rules or etiquette. It was about survival, about seeking comfort in a world that had so far offered little. From a corner of the church, the quiet Apache observed the scene with steady eyes. He noticed the baby's hands clawing at the blanket, the uneven rise and fall of his chest, and the way the child's eyes, wide and unblinking, searched the faces around him. Unlike the townspeople, he did not flinch at the sound, nor did he avert his gaze. He understood, instinctively, that the infant's cries were not a nuisance. They were a call, a plea for protection and connection. While others hesitated, paralyzed by etiquette and fear, he saw an opportunity to act where others had not. The tension in the church was reaching a breaking point. Some mourners grew restless, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or to step away. The baby, oblivious to social hesitation, continued to wail, each cry a louder, more. The air inside the church was thick with unease. The baby's cries had grown relentless, reverberating off the wooden walls and high rafters, a harsh contrast to the muffled sobs of grieving adults. Yet despite the urgency of the child's need, the townspeople froze. Each person seemed paralyzed, caught between the pull of social expectation and the instinct to help. Their hesitation was almost tangible, a barrier as solid as the rough-hewn pews that confined them. A few relatives glanced nervously at one another, shifting from foot to foot. "I can't hold him," one woman whispered, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He's so loud, and I'm not strong enough." A man sitting nearby nodded, frowning. "It's the wrong place. Someone should step outside with him." But when hands reached toward the infant, they wavered in the air, unsure, retreating before making contact. Their fear wasn't born of malice but of discomfort, the discomfort of stepping into a situation they had never been trained to navigate, a situation that required courage they didn't know they possessed. It was as if the baby's vulnerability exposed something deeper in the townspeople, a fear of responsibility, a fear of doing wrong, a fear of stepping beyond the rules that governed life in their rigid little frontier town. Caring for a child at a funeral was outside their customs. They had been raised to mourn silently, to respect boundaries, to avoid drawing attention. And now, in the face of raw, unmediated need, their values had become shackles, preventing them from acting. The cries persisted, high-pitched and insistent, and with each wail, the tension intensified. Eyes darted nervously toward the door, toward the corners of the church, toward anyone else who might take charge. But everyone assumed someone else would act first. In their hesitation, the baby's small, desperate demands took on the weight of accusation, a silent indictment of their collective inaction. He was tiny, yet his presence seemed to dominate the room, forcing the adults to confront not only his suffering but their own limitations. Some villagers murmured excuses under their breath. "He's too young," said one. "We can't handle this right now," said another. Even the older, more experienced townsfolk hesitated, unsure whether it was proper or even safe to intervene. And yet, the baby's cries did not relent. They grew louder, more insistent, like a heartbeat echoing against the walls, insisting on being acknowledged, insisting on being heard. It was in this moment, amid collective hesitation and unspoken judgment, that the contrast between fear and courage became starkly clear. The townspeople represented paralysis, the inability to act when action was most needed. And in the shadows, observing quietly, stood the Apache man. He watched not with judgment, but with understanding, seeing the child's needs and recognizing the opportunity to step forward where everyone else hesitated. The church, once a sanctuary of ritualized grief, had become a crucible. The infant's wails were no longer just cries, they were a test. A test of empathy, a test of courage, and a test of the town's ability to rise above its rigid codes and discomfort. Each hesitant glance, each retreating hand, reinforced the urgency. Someone needed to act, or the baby's suffering would continue unabated. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the Apache moved closer. Unlike the townspeople, he did not question his ability, nor did he pause to weigh propriety against need. His calm, deliberate motion was an unspoken promise. He would meet the child's need with courage, patience, and compassion. In that subtle act, the story began to pivot, signaling that the moment of change of bravery and connection was approaching. The townspeople, for all their hesitation, could not ignore what was coming. The tension, thick as the dust-laden air of the church, was about to give way to a simple truth. Sometimes it takes a quiet heart to act where many are afraid. At the edge of the pews, almost blending into the shadows, stood the Apache man. He was a quiet figure, unassuming, yet there was an undeniable presence about him. He had lived on the outskirts of the town for years, quietly observing from a distance, rarely intervening in the affairs of settlers. Some considered him mysterious, others thought him strange. But there was a calmness in his demeanor, a depth of understanding that few could match. Today, that quiet observation would make all the difference. He watched the infant with steady eyes, noting the child's every movement, the flailing arms, the frantic kicks of tiny legs, the tear-streaked face and wailing mouth. Unlike the townspeople, he did not flinch or avert his gaze. He did not murmur excuses or pass judgment on their hesitation. To him, the baby's cries were not a disruption. They were a call to action. They were a call to a kind of courage the townspeople had forgotten, a courage that transcended social rules and cultural boundaries. The Apache's calm contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding the child. The adults fumbled, unsure, their discomfort radiating like heat from every tense shoulder and anxious glance. Yet he remained still, grounded, his presence alone bringing a quiet gravity to the room. There was a subtle authority in the way he held himself, not loud, not commanding, but undeniable. Even the infant, sensing the steadiness of this figure, paused for a brief moment, eyes searching the unfamiliar face. He had seen the ways of grief and loss before, though in different lands and under different skies. He understood the fragility of life, the necessity of compassion, and the courage required to act when others hesitate. And now, In this small frontier church, surrounded by townspeople frozen in fear and propriety, he recognized an opportunity to bridge the gap between need and action, between despair and care. As he took a deliberate step closer, the murmurs and whispers of the crowd grew faint in his awareness. He focused solely on the child, letting the world around him blur. There was no judgment, no hesitation, only recognition of the infant's vulnerability and the quiet certainty that he could help. This was not an act of heroism for recognition. It was a simple, instinctive choice to do what needed to be done. The townspeople noticed him moving, but their reactions were mixed. Some watched with awe, others with suspicion. "What is he doing?" Someone muttered, uncertain. "He shouldn't. It's not proper." Yet the child's cries had already pierced their defenses, leaving them powerless to act themselves. All eyes fell on the Apache, as if the town collectively held its breath, waiting to see whether he would falter like the rest or rise. As the Apache drew closer to the infant, a ripple of tension spread through the congregation. The townspeople's eyes widened, some narrowing in suspicion, others darting nervously between the child and the quiet man approaching him. Whispers broke out, low and uncertain, echoing along the timber-bird walls. "He shouldn't touch the baby," someone muttered. "What if something happens? He's not one of us." A few of the more outspoken villagers shook their heads, their faces tight with disapproval. Some looked to neighbors for agreement. Others clutched their hats to their chests, a feeble shield against their discomfort. The baby, oblivious to the judgment swirling around him, continued to wail, each cry seeming to grow louder in response to the tension. In the midst of this unease, the Apache remained steady, calm, and deliberate, like a rock unshaken by the storm of suspicion surrounding him. The conflict was subtle, yet sharp. It wasn't a quarrel shouted across the pews, but a quiet moral tension that pressed down on everyone present. The villagers struggled between ingrained prejudice, fear of the unknown, and the undeniable human instinct to help a helpless child. Some glanced at each other with hesitation, unsure whether they should intervene or remain passive. Their reluctance revealed an uncomfortable truth. In moments of moral challenge, fear often outweighs compassion. Even as the murmurs grew, the Apache continued his approach, bending slightly so that he could meet the child at eye level. He extended his hands gently, palms open, offering comfort without force. The baby paused mid-cry, startled by the calm presence but sensing no threat. There was a brief moment of stillness, a fragile, delicate pause in the storm of grief and suspicion. A few villagers tensed, ready to intervene, as if the Apache's kindness might somehow be inappropriate or dangerous. "Stop, he's a stranger." Someone hissed, "You don't know him." But the words fell flat against the simple truth of the situation. The infant needed care, and no one else had acted. In that quiet church, the Apache's courage became a silent rebuke to the inaction and prejudice of the townspeople. The baby's eyes, wide and glimmering with tears, fixed on the Apache's face. Something instinctive passed between them, a recognition of safety, a spark of trust in the midst of fear. The infant's cries faltered, his small hands reaching tentatively toward the open, steady hands before him. The tension in the room shifted. It was still thick, still palpable, but it had begun to transform. Suspicion gave way to reluctant awe, disapproval softened into contemplation, and the possibility of connection began to pierce the rigid boundaries of social fear. For the first time in the funeral, hope flickered. The child's need had forced the community to confront their discomfort, their hesitation, and their biases. And the Apache's unwavering presence demonstrated something simple yet profound, that courage and empathy do not require approval, that compassion does not need permission, and that a single act of quiet bravery can begin to unravel the walls built by fear and tradition. As he knelt, the Apache's eyes met the baby's, steady and warm. The townspeople watched, silently judging, silently learning, silently questioning themselves. In this small church, amid grief and hesitation, the first real step toward change had begun. The quiet Apache had not just stepped forward physically, he had stepped forward into the moral center of the town, challenging all who hesitated to see what it truly meant to act with courage and compassion. The Apache knelt fully now, bringing himself to the infant's level, his movements deliberate and calm. Every sound around him, the shuffling feet, whispered doubts, the persistent wails of the child faded into the background. He focused solely on the baby, on the fragile life that had cried unanswered for so long. His hands, large yet gentle, reached slowly toward the infant, offering a sense of steadiness the child had never felt. For a moment, the baby recoiled instinctively, tiny fists flailing against the unfamiliar touch. But the Apache did not withdraw. Instead, he softened his approach, murmuring in a low, melodic tone, his voice a soothing counterpoint to the child's sharp cries. The cadence was gentle, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, bridging the distance between fear and trust. Slowly, the infant's body began to relax, the tiny shoulders dropping from their tense curl, the quivering lips pausing mid-wail. The congregation watched in hushed awe. Some leaned forward slightly, curiosity edging out skepticism. Others looked away, ashamed that their own hesitation had allowed suffering to persist so long. The baby's cries, once relentless and commanding, became intermittent, less urgent, as if sensing that for the first time someone truly cared. The Apache's presence was steady, unwavering, a solid anchor in the storm of grief and doubt that surrounded them all. Gently, he lifted the baby into his arms, supporting the fragile body with skill born of intuition rather than formal training. The infant stiffened for a heartbeat then, sensing the calm strength in the Apache's embrace, allowed himself to be held. The wails softened into hiccuping sobs, then slowly faded to small, tentative whimpers. For the first time since the funeral began, silence began to settle, not the heavy silence of suppressed grief, but the peaceful silence of reassurance. The townspeople shifted in their seats, noticing the transformation. Some exchanged astonished glances, silently acknowledging the courage and empathy it had taken for this quiet man to act when they could not. Others lowered their heads, their own inadequacy reflected in the calm intimacy unfolding before them. The Apache's act of simple compassion had begun to teach them a lesson they could not ignore. True courage often comes not with loud declarations, but with quiet, steady action in the face of fear and uncertainty. As the baby nestled closer, cheeks pressed against the Apache's shoulder, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The fragile life, once a source of discomfort and anxiety, had become a symbol of trust and hope. The act of stepping forward, so small, so unassuming, yet so profound, shifted the energy of the room. Where fear had ruled, care now prevailed. Where hesitation had lingered, action had taken root. The child's whimpers gradually faded into soft, contented murmurs. The Apache rocked him gently, humming a quiet tune, and for the first time, the funeral was no longer defined by death alone. It was also defined by life, by the enduring human capacity for empathy, and by the courage to act even when no one else will. In that single, unremarkable act, the quiet Apache had changed the course of not just. With the baby cradled gently in his arms, the Apache allowed himself to relax, letting the infant feel the calm steadiness of his presence. He hummed a soft, low melody, the kind he had learned in his youth, simple, soothing, and strangely melodic to the untrained ear. The baby, initially startled by the new rhythm, gradually quieted, small hands gripping at the Apache's shirt in tentative trust. Every breath the child took seemed to synchronize with the steady cadence of the Apache's voice, and a fragile bond began to form in the quiet church. The townspeople watched, mesmerized, their earlier skepticism giving way to curiosity and wonder. They noticed the transformation. The infant, once screaming with unrelenting intensity, now gazed up at the Apache with wide, trusting eyes. Each gentle pat, each soothing hum, built a connection invisible to the eye but palpable in the energy of the room. The congregation began to sense something remarkable, a lesson in patience, empathy, and the subtle power of presence. The Apache's hands moved with deliberate care, adjusting the swaddling and supporting the baby's small head. He spoke softly, a mix of words from his own tongue and simple English phrases, creating a rhythm the infant instinctively understood. The baby relaxed further, curling into the Apache's chest, and for the first time the wailing ceased entirely. The child's whimpers faded to tiny sighs, and then to quiet breathing, each sound a testament to trust slowly replacing fear. The townspeople began to murmur quietly among themselves, some nodding with reluctant admiration. They could see the courage it took for one man to act when so many others had frozen, paralyzed by doubt and prejudice. The child's comfort was not just a product of physical touch, but of emotional resonance, the kind of connection that could not be forced or faked. In witnessing this, the villagers felt something awaken within them, a recognition of what it meant to care selflessly, without hesitation, without expectation of reward. The bond between the Apache and the baby deepened with each passing moment. Tiny fingers clutched at his clothing, resting against his chest, while his small head nestled safely into the curve of the Apache's arm. The hum of the melody, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the unwavering calm in his eyes created a safe world for the child, a world absent of fear, doubt, or judgment. The church, once filled with tension and unease, now held a gentle, warm atmosphere. It was quiet, not because of grief, but because of the fragile intimacy that had emerged. For the Apache, the act of soothing the infant was natural, instinctive. It required no ceremony or approval, only a willingness to step forward where others had held back. And for the child, this quiet attentiveness was life-changing. In the span of minutes, trust had been built where fear had reigned, and the infant, though small and powerless, had found solace in a stranger's arms. The townspeople, witnessing this small miracle, began to understand the power of empathy and quiet courage. Some moved slightly closer, unsure if their presence would be welcomed, yet drawn by the tenderness unfolding before them. Others simply observed in reverent silence, their hearts stirring with a mix of awe, shame, and inspiration. Through this simple act, the Apache had shown them that true strength often lies not in loud declarations or bold gestures, but in calm, patient presence and the courage to meet need without fear. In that moment, the baby and the Apache were no longer simply child and stranger, they were a living testament to the transformative power of care. Connection and trust, a quiet reminder that compassion could bridge any gap, no matter how wide. The quiet miracle unfolding before the town began to stir something long dormant in the hearts of the villagers. At first, they only watched, unsure of how to respond to what they were seeing. Their fear, hesitation, and ingrained social rules had kept them frozen, but now, as they observed the Apache cradling and soothing the infant, a subtle change began. Hearts softened, eyes widened, and minds opened to possibilities they had never considered. Some villagers shifted in their seats, leaning forward slightly, drawn by curiosity and wonder. He's actually calming him," whispered one woman, her voice tinged with awe. Another, an older man with deep lines etched from years of hard work, nodded slowly. "I've never seen patience like that," he murmured under his breath. The transformation was not instantaneous, but the seeds of empathy were being planted, and awareness had begun to replace prejudice. The townspeople had come to believe that action required recognition, authority, or adherence to rules. Yet here was a quiet man, an outsider in many ways, demonstrating that courage and compassion needed no permission. The simplicity of the Apache's act, kneeling, humming softly, and holding the child with care contrasted sharply with the hesitation and inaction that had filled the room moments before. In that contrast, the villagers glimpsed a truth they could not ignore. Fear is often louder than courage, but courage quietly persists where it matters most. Children and adults alike watched as the infant's small size and tentative movements mirrored trust growing in real time. The baby, once the center of tension, had become a bridge between worlds, between grief and comfort, between suspicion and understanding, between fear and empathy. Slowly, the townspeople began to soften toward him. Some reached out cautiously, offering blankets or small gestures of reassurance, their own awkwardness dissipating in the warmth of shared care. Even those who had initially whispered disapproval or judgment felt the stirrings of humility. The experience challenged deeply held assumptions about who could help, whose guidance mattered, and what it truly meant to act with heart. Watching the Apache nurture the child forced the community to confront their own failures, to recognize the times they had turned away from need, because it was inconvenient, uncomfortable, or socially improper. For the first time in the service, grief did not feel isolating. It felt communal, connected through shared witness to an act of. By the time the funeral drew to a close, the atmosphere in the church had transformed completely. Where moments before there had been tension, hesitation, and whispered doubts, now there was a quiet sense of collective reflection and tentative acceptance. The baby, once the epicenter of discomfort and unease, rested comfortably in the Apache's arms, his breathing slow and even, his tiny body relaxed and secure. The townspeople, who had at first recoiled from the child's cries, began to approach cautiously. Some offered soft words. Others extended blankets or small gifts, tokens of care they had previously been too hesitant to provide. Their gestures were tentative, yet genuine. The walls of suspicion and fear that had divided the town from both the child and the Apache had begun to crumble, replaced by shared acknowledgement of what it meant to act with courage and compassion. Even those who had initially been vocal in their disapproval now looked on with quiet humility. They had witnessed something remarkable, that a single, calm, and deliberate act of empathy could bridge gaps, dissolve mistrust, and inspire others to follow. The Apache had shown them that heroism did not always come with fanfare, and that the courage to act often arrived in the quietest, simplest ways. The baby stirred, lifting his tiny face to gaze at the townspeople. Recognition and curiosity sparkled in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the kindness surrounding him. The Apache, still holding the child gently, smiled faintly, his presence a reassuring constant. In this simple, shared moment, the town began to understand the transformative power of compassion, not just toward the vulnerable, but toward one another. As neighbors stepped forward to help carry the infant, adjust his blanket, or simply offer comfort, a sense of unity settled over the group. The funeral, meant to honor the deceased, had unexpectedly become a testament to the resilience of life and the enduring importance of human connection. The Apache, once an outsider in both culture and presence, had become a bridge between worlds, a reminder that understanding and courage often arise where fear and prejudice once reigned. By the time the townspeople filed out of the church and into the bright afternoon light, there was a new sense of hope lingering in the air. Conversations were softer, smiles more genuine, and glances exchanged carried a newfound respect for each other, for the child and for the quiet man who had taught them a lesson they would not soon forget. The baby, once ignored and avoided, had become a symbol of trust, innocence, and the quiet power of love. For the Apache, the act required little fanfare. He did not boast or seek acknowledgement. Yet his courage had sparked change, showing that sometimes one person, willing to step forward, can alter the course of an entire community. The townspeople, having witnessed his compassion, now carried that lesson with them, a reminder that humanity is measured not only in words, but in the actions we take when others hesitate. As the church emptied, and the shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the town, a sense of resolution settled into the hearts of those present. The baby was safe. The Apache had acted, and the town, having observed and reflected, had begun to understand that courage and empathy could transform fear into love, hesitation into connection, and grief into an opportunity for growth. Days passed, and yet the memory of that quiet, extraordinary moment lingered in the hearts of the townspeople. The funeral of John Harper had become more than a ceremony of mourning. It had transformed into a testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and human connection. The baby, once the center of fear and avoidance, now thrived under the gentle care that had first been offered by the Apache. His cries, which had once filled the church with tension, had become a symbol of resilience, trust, and the promise of life continuing despite loss. The Apache, who had returned to the periphery of town after the funeral, remained a quiet yet respected presence. His act of courage did not make him a hero in the traditional sense, for he never sought recognition. Yet in the eyes of the villagers, he had become a living example of the strength that comes from empathy and patience. Children whispered his name with reverence. Parents nodded knowingly when recounting the story, and elders reflected on how a single, selfless act could ripple outward to touch an entire community. The townspeople themselves had changed. Prejudice and hesitation, once ingrained habits, had been challenged by the simplicity of one man's willingness to act. They had learned that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in a tender gesture, in the steadiness of a hand, or in the patience required to calm a frightened child. The Apache's actions had opened their eyes to the idea that strength and morality were measured not in authority or tradition, but in the choices made when faced with human need. The baby grew surrounded by this newfound community care, a living reminder of the day the quiet Apache stepped forward. As he toddled through the streets, he became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the possibility of kindness prevailing in a world often hardened by fear. The townspeople, inspired by the lesson of empathy, slowly embraced a more compassionate way of living, one in which small acts of courage could shape the lives of many. In quiet moments, those who had witnessed the event often reflected on the delicate balance between fear and action. They remembered the tension in the church, the uncertainty that had paralyzed so many, and the profound difference made by one man's choice to act. The lesson was clear. It only takes one person, brave enough to step forward when others hesitate, to transform suffering into comfort, isolation into connection, and grief into hope. And so, the story of that funeral, the baby's cries, the villagers' hesitation, and the quiet Apache's courage passed into local memory. A legend whispered from parent to child, retold, with reverence for the quiet hero who had reminded them all of the simplest truth.